I thought I'd start, Bob. It's an honor to be doing this with you here tonight, I should say, and I love this book. Maybe just to read a couple tweets just to get started. This won't take too long. Must-read column by Bob Woodward explaining how Obama pushed for sequestration and promised no tax increase. Only the Obama White House can get away with attacking Bob Woodward. Thank you to Bob Woodward, who said, et cetera, et cetera. Now, who could have written those?
Yeah, Trump.
Yeah.
And even last month, he called me, and he wondered why I hadn't been interviewed for the book, and I had tried many people, and he said, well, you know, people are afraid to talk to him. He acknowledged a little of this, but then he said, you've always treated me fairly. Now the book is out, he's changed his mind.
Yeah. I thought that was an extraordinary tape of that interview with him. I want to ask you about that in a second. But one thing you can say about Trump for sure is he's media savvy. He's a massive consumer of media. I think you talk about him watching 6 to 8 hours of television a day. He actually does seem to read the New York Times and other papers. He knows what background means. He knows his way around the media. How could he be so naive as to be surprised? I mean, do you think there's any? Is he sincerely? Is he sincere in saying that he thinks he was done wrong, or is this just his usual act?
Easier to describe the creation of the universe. There's a lot of uncertainty about what is driving him, but one of the themes of the book is there is an alternative reality which he has, which he creates, and he just has certain views, and there's scene after scene where one of the people in the White House, where did you get that? He said, well, I've always thought that for 30 years. And then he'll just say, if you disagree with me, you're wrong. Yeah. And that's it. And there's not, they bring in Gary Cohn, who's the chief economic advisor to Trump in the White House. Had been the president of a little investment bank called Goldman Sachs, and had literally made billions of dollars for his clients, hundreds of millions of dollars for himself. And if you know anything about Goldman Sachs, it's data-driven. If they'll bring in piles of evidence and studies and reports, economic data, and he would take things like this to Trump, and it was just, I don't care about that. They come in on the World Trade Organization. It sounds like an abstraction, but it's real. And Trump says, this is the world's worst organization. We never win a case. And Cohen says, well, United States has won 85.7%, and not just 85%, but 85.7%. And Trump, I don't care, that's not right. Well, call your people, call your trade representative. No, I'm not going to do that. So there's just the veil comes down, and he's going to live in that cave that he's created.
And there's this tremendous simplification of the world. I think at one point in the book you reproduce his handwriting, which finally distills his view of trade. Trade is bad.
Yes.
That's his view.
Yeah. And this is the nationalism, this is the isolation, now he never, in fairness to him, never said that, but he actually wrote it out in trying to revise a speech. And if you dig into this, you see that's really kind of his view, that somehow if we have a trade deficit with the country, they are stealing money from us, which 99.9% of economists would say is not the case. But Trump found two who would agree with him, Peter Navarro and Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, and so Trump and those two people. And left, right, Democrats, Republicans just say you shouldn't do these things, and it's the wall.
Yeah, and there's lots in the book about trade, and it does seem to be one area where he has had a consistent view, say what you will about it, over a long period of time, and he's constantly trying to act on his views, to pull out of the U.S.-Korea trade agreement, to pull out of NAFTA, to attack the WTO, to add more tariffs on China right now, and there are people around him other than those two who are fighting a rearguard action against him.
Yes, but he says, no, I'm going to do it, and they can't stop him, and he calls like on the issue of steel tariffs, which just make no economic sense. Yeah. I mean, there are documents I have that I quote from the Pentagon, from the State Department, saying steel tariffs don't work, don't help. And so he sneaks the steel executives into the White House in March of this year and announces steel tariffs. And even General Kelly, who's the chief of staff, didn't know that Trump was doing this. So as people try to stop him, he forges ahead.
Yeah. That tape you put up on the Washington Post of him claiming that he didn't know that you wanted to interview him was fascinating. But his view seemed to be that your book was going to be wrong on the facts, and this has been his view since it came out, because it did not include the fact that he's the greatest president of all time.
Yeah, I left that out.
If you included it, he'd still be saying Woodward is fair, everyone knows. Yeah.
Well, but you know what? This is, you drive toward what's inside him. What's it all about? One thought I had is all presidents, and Trump is the 9th president that I've written about, and Ken Burns mentioned to me some time ago, he said, you will have written books and journalism in the Washington Post on 20% of our presidents. 9
Wow.
out of 49. I wasn't around for Calvin Coolidge. But
I hope you get another one to write about very soon.
We'll see. But see, we don't know. Yeah. We don't know. People didn't think Trump could be elected. It was all improbable. But there's something, when you read biographies or autobiographies of presidents, they all start talking about at one point or another about destiny, that somehow this was not an accident. And there is a self-validation when you were elected president that gives you, I know how to do this. In Trump's case, everyone was telling him, no, it will never work, it's not going to happen, and he wins. He'd never been on the city council. He'd never done anything in government. So it puts his feet deeper in more cement about, I'm right, I've got it. And all presidents, I think, have the disease of isolation, and I think he, in a much greater way. And this is why in the book you see people close to him taking papers off his desk or having to tell him things or argue with him. He's created this Trump world, and he is also conducting a war on truth. Yeah. Whenever somebody comes in with something and something is true, it's warfare. Yeah. If he doesn't like it or disagrees.
And I think as the press, we are still dealing and haven't figured out how to navigate this problem of how do you cover a president where there is no presumption that what he says is true. Because every president probably lies to some degree. But you have details.
My newspaper, the Washington Post, has 4,272 counting. And lies or misrepresentations, and so it's it's something, you're exactly right, that's kind of stumped the press. I mean, counting is not enough. You have to write about the consequences of not dealing with reality. And I think the consequences are grave, and I think that based on spending a year and a half trying to really look at the granularity of the Trump decision-making and presidency, that the people who know the most consider him a threat to national security and financial security.
Yeah, I mean, David Fahrenthold, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter at the Post, did a brilliant thing when instead of trying to prove that Trump hadn't contributed to charities before running for president, he tried to prove that he had contributed to charity and couldn't prove it. And I sometimes think we have the same problem with inverting our assumption. With every other president, it's been presumed truthful until proven to be not telling the truth. But with Trump, we can't assume that. So how do we recalibrate around that?
And I think the answer is in-depth reporting. What I found is, let's not look at the lies, let's not look at the Mueller investigation. Both of those are very important. But ultimately, what does he do as president? How did the North Korean policy develop? How about Afghanistan? How about the Middle East? How about taxes, trade, all of these core issues, which really define life for people in this country. And it's quite a bobsled ride when you see it. I hate to say this, but this is an analytical point. He does not understand his own best interest often.
Yeah. Well, clearly, I mean, you're famous for your neutrality and letting your reporting speak for itself. This book, I have to say, having read the vast majority of your books, felt a little different. I mean, starting with the cover, it was hard not to see this as the inversion of the Obama Hope poster, but I felt like, that was conscious, wasn't it? I mean, one word for Trump is fear. I mean, it just felt like from the very first page, I felt like I knew what you thought.
Well, actually, there's some good things in there, and the dealings in the Middle East. He actually develops a policy and goes to Saudi Arabia and builds an alliance with Saudi Arabia, with the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, with Israel. This is a very strong alliance against Iran, which is one of the great worries. So I tried to keep it neutral and repertorial, but fear comes from his own mouth.
Yes.
When Bob Costa, young, great reporter at the Post, and I interviewed Trump 2.5 years ago when he was on the verge of getting the Republican nomination, and we asked him, we were asking some broad, interesting questions and addressing the issue of power, because the presidency really is about power, isn't it? And quoted some Obama comment about real power is not having to use violence. And Trump, finally said, I mean, it was almost a Shakespearean moment where he said, real power is, I don't like to use the word fear. And the way it was Hamlet, his aside to the audience of, this is what I really think. And it's about, this is how you exercise power. Yeah. You scare the hell out of people. And you see a lot of that in the book. You see a lot of that in Trump's performance in life before he became president.
But there's a clear message here that the man in the White House is dangerous and that no one can protect us from him.
Yes, and that's the words of the people and the actions of the people who are there. And it's vivid in scene after scene. And it's most interesting because presidents, I think all of them, live in the unfinished business of their predecessor, like Obama told Trump, what's going to keep you up at night is North Korea. And at the same time, presidents inherit a framework, the way business was done, and you can change it, but you can't abrogate it. You can't destroy it. And he's tried to, and there's this meeting over at the Pentagon in July, which is a stunner, because Gary Cohn, national security, the economic advisor, and Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, have formed an alliance, and they say, we've got to get Trump over here. It's kind of like an offsite at the Greenbrier, but we're going to do it at the Pentagon because there are no televisions, there's no distraction. And he can't call out to his secretary, Madeline, and they try to educate him, and they say there's, as Mattis says, it's a great line, the great gift from the greatest generation is this world, this rule-based international order. And Tillerson, then Secretary of State, says, this keeps the peace. And Trump just doesn't want to sign up to any of the old things, and just insults everyone, gets angry, discards, won't listen. And at the end, Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, is just deflated. It's just like, we tried. And this is when Tillerson says, as accurately reported by NBC, that he's a, should I say it, effing moron.
Yeah.
And
you didn't say it.
Yeah, okay. but he said it very plainly, and that's so. How do you manage power?
I mean, that was one of those scenes, Bob, where just my jaw was on the floor, because there you have the most senior and distinguished military leaders in the country. And Trump, we know from elsewhere in the book, he sort of prefers people in uniform. I mean, he likes military leaders and gives them more respect than he gives anybody else. And in that meeting, he treats them the way bad people treat busboys in restaurants. I mean, he just is so contemptuous of them and dismissive of them, and I mean, deflating would be a nice word, but his behavior with them is despicable. If he doesn't give them respect, is there anyone who can get respect from Donald Trump?
Well, but again, this is why fear fits, and it is also. I kind of think from studying all these presidents that the most important characteristic a president can have is the ability to listen and grow and understand and accommodate reality while directing the policy their way. And he just doesn't want to learn, doesn't want to listen.
So many of these people who work for Trump justify working for him by telling themselves, and presumably telling other people and telling you, it would be worse if I weren't there. We are protecting the public from his worst actions and his worst instincts. What do you think of that justification at this point?
But it's actually more. In the case, the prologue, where Gary Cohn takes this letter that would get us out of the trade agreement with South Korea, and it kind of, it's a trade agreement, but it's not. There's a military agreement, there's very secret intelligence partnerships that give this country a degree of security that people don't understand, and this is all linked together. And so if you pull out of the trade agreement, you can start.
It's a dotted line to nuclear war.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And if there's a job the president has, is to not play around with that. I remember interviewing President Obama once about this, and he said, everything is about keeping a nuclear weapon from going off in an American city. That is, and he said, all our intelligence operations are geared toward making sure that doesn't happen. And Trump is cavalier about this, but Gary Cohen, instead of saying, well, I'm just kind, he says, got to protect the country. This is, you begin the unraveling, and God knows what's going to happen. And the same thing happens with the trade agreement, NAFTA. There's a letter, summarily, we're getting out of it, and Cohen takes it. Rob Porter, the staff secretary, is doing all of this and had told people, and I quote him saying, a third of his time is preventing bad things from happening.
Yeah. But, my question again to you is, what do you ultimately think of that justification? This is an issue I've been struggling with since the beginning of the administration. At one level, I think we're worse off with Gary Cohen gone and H.R. McMaster gone. And, I'd rather have relatively competent people around him. At the same time, I kind of feel like they're kidding themselves.
Well, it's not, you don't get to take a college course in philosophy when you're confronted with that moment, oh my God, this is on the desk and he could get it formally drafted and sign it, and so you have to act. And I think these are acts of conscience and courage. But it's not something that you should say, let's run the government this way. Let's have the president, there's the Trump track, and then there's the sane track, where we're going to have people coming around taking papers, not implementing the policy. And literally, the chief of staff, General Kelly, has to send out a memo to everyone in the White House that says no more spur-of-the-moment decisions, no more seat-of-the-pants decisions. Nothing is final until there's a formal process of review by cabinet officers and a decision memo signed by the president. And of course, this never takes off. Yeah. And so it's a little of, it's the Wild West.
Yeah.
And given the stakes internationally and to the global economy and the American economy, it's not, I would argue, if you're a Trump supporter and you read this neutrally and you realized that it's meticulously reported, you would have to have pause.
Yeah. This question about protecting the country from Trump's worst instincts is also the theme of the anonymous New York Times op-ed. First, I got to ask you, before someone else in the audience did, I won't ask you who wrote it, I'll give you my theory.
I have it written down right here.
Yeah. No, I'm just going to give you my theory. It's actually not my theory, it's the theory that Will Salatin wrote in Slate, but I found very persuasive. He thinks it's John Huntsman, the ambassador to Russia, whose views are a match, who doesn't have much loyalty to Trump, and whose denial was a very non-denial denial. What do you think? We might be right?
I don't know, but it's important who that is. And if it's the ambassador to Russia, it's not as if it's somebody key in the White House. As we well know, ambassadors are isolated also. And if that person had come to me and said, gee, I'd like you to append this as an op-ed statement from me anonymously in your book, I would say, wait a minute, details. The building blocks of journalism are details. What exactly happened? Who was there? What was said? What was driving this? And the absence of that leaves me kind of, what is this?
You don't doubt that there's a real person who wrote it?
I don't, because I don't think the New York Times would take that chance. But who's that real person? See, in doing a book like this, the method is to go to people and say, okay, I want the full story, I want your notes, I want documents. You're a confidential source, I'm not gonna name you. I'm gonna use everything you say, I'm gonna cross-check it within an inch of its life. And then you can go and see what happens in the Situation Room or the Oval Office at a specific time with specific issues, and a kind of generalized statement. I'm not wild about that. Now, maybe it's Melania, or maybe it's maybe it's somebody who really knows Trump. I'm not seriously suggesting that. I'm just saying it may be somebody in the White House who's there, who's a witness. The most important element in describing what really goes on is having witnesses who are there or have diaries, that you as a journalist or book author can build a relationship of trust with.
I mean, whoever wrote it, it seems like a bit of a miscalculation in the way that some of the people who spoke to you may be feeling they miscalculated, in that you say, I want to tell everybody that we're working to protect you from our dangerously paranoid president, but you do it in a way that spurs his paranoia and his dangerousness and makes him more dangerous.
Yeah, well, that's, it's part of, it is what it is, but it doesn't meet the threshold of the kind of journalism that I think is really important, which is specific.
Let's talk about your method a little bit and how it's evolved. But just to start out, I was making a little note as I was reading of, probable sources for your book: Steve Bannon, Rob Porter, Lindsey Graham, John Dowd, Gary Cohn, Tom Bossert, a little less, former Homeland Security people. So these people are not very well hidden. Their thoughts are described. The question is, and I'm not asking you to confirm that they're sources, but when
oh, I'm so glad you weren't going to ask.
Yeah, because I know you give them up pretty easily.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll come back in 50 years.
Yeah.
But it's not hard to read this and have a strong opinion about who the sources probably are. People are going to talk to you and not do a better job of hiding. Why not just talk on the record? Why not be quoted? Why not put actual quotation marks around their remarks?
Well, there are actual quotation remarks around lots of people, including President Trump, that they are, these, as you've seen people deny some of these things, and it's vague or it doesn't have much weight. These are kind of job security denials, that where people don't, they want to protect themselves, but they want to talk. And this goes back to the Watergate coverage, or the 18 books that I've done involve using people who are confidential sources, who are participants and witnesses.
Yeah. I mean, I've never seen more ritualistic denials than in this case. I mean, it almost just seems like, Trump said you have to deny it. They go through the motion with a, they don't deny anything specifically. They say the book's inaccurate or doesn't portray what I think. And, what do they expect you to think when you see that they have to do that?
I'm sympathetic because, again, this is not. These are big decisions people make to say, I'm going to trust you with my story, and I'm going to tell you what I witnessed. And I have interviews with, you ask about method, tape with their knowledge. So in 50 years, somebody's going to get these boxes of hundreds of hours of interviews, and some graduate student is going to look through it and is going to say, oh my God, that's a document. Oh, this is a witness. This is the person talking. And it's a method that we used in the Nixon case, that I used in the Supreme Court book, or the Pentagon books, or the war books, or Obama books. And I remember when doing an interview with Obama for the first book, Obama's Wars, about his decisions in Afghanistan. And near the end, he said, you have better sources than I do. Now, that's not true, but I've been able to focus on this, and he actually said, have you ever thought of becoming the CIA director? It was not a job offer.
Well, your files probably rival Hoover's at this point.
Pardon?
Your files rival Hoover's at this point.
No, they're not like Hoover's. They're not about somebody's personal life. They're about the business of government. I mean, this is a very serious undertaking, but you can get really close to what goes on, and that has to do with trusting people, people trusting you. So I understand the dynamic here. There's a kind of Washington denial machine out there. And during Watergate, we called it the non-denial denial, and it sounds like a denial, but it really isn't.
Not technically untrue. Talk a little bit about how your method has evolved since Watergate. You get your sources to come to your house, right? I wish I could get a source to come to my house. Well, other than that you can and they'll do it. Why do you do that?
Well, not just the real important is to get to their house. Yeah. And I frankly realized in doing some reporting on this that I was getting quite lazy. Yeah, I have people come over for dinner, it's nice, you chat, you advance the ball a little bit, but there was a moment in this when I called somebody from the White House at home at 11 o'clock and said, you said we'd talk. Yeah, we will. The brush off happens all the time. Post, yes, we'll do it. Oh, I said, well, how about now? And he said, now? Are you crazy? It's 11 o'clock at night. And I said, well, I'm 4 minutes from your house. And he said, how do you know where I live? And I said, that's easy. That's the easy part. Okay, come on over. And then there's a natural comfort people have in their own home. You asked, do you have any documents? No, I don't take any documents from the White House. And then in the third interview, any documents? Well, yeah, let me go upstairs and check. And come down with, boxes of documents. It's when we did the book on the Supreme Court in 1970, all the clerks, never have documents. And of course, everyone. You don't clerk at the Supreme Court or work in the White House and not just take a little memorabilia home. And that kind of memorabilia or a diary, people have diaries and so forth. And so getting into the home is really important. And it gives you potential access to the kind of authoritative paperwork that will, it's very comforting to have somebody tell you something and then see a memo that says exactly the same thing.
One more question about this, but I want to open it up for questions, and there are microphones on either side. As you said, we're taking questions live, not on note cards today. So if you line up, we'll call in a second. But just as to follow up that point, Bob, while people get ready to ask, in All the President's Men, which I've reread recently, there's some different method. You sometimes surprise people by knocking on their doors at night. And a lot of the reporting comes through discomfort. What you're describing sounds more like a process of getting people very comfortable. So that is discomfort still a part of your process, or is it more?
Yeah, but it starts as discomfort and then it transitions to comfort. Yeah. And that's exactly what happened in All the President's Men. I remember one of the Bush books there was a general who would not talk and kept nagging him, emails, intermediaries, nothing, found out where he lived in the Washington area, went to his house without an appointment, knocked on the door, and he opened the door and looked at me and said, "Are you still doing this shit?" And he meant it. And but then you learn, CIA people always said, you have to let the silence suck out the truth. So I just poker-faced, and he looked at me, got a disappointed look. I think in himself, come on in, and talked for a couple of hours and helped immensely. Lesson there, we're not showing up. I think our method is driven us to the internet more and kind of, oh, what's your comment on this? And I know people will sit in the White House, you ask a question and they have 6 deputy press secretaries. Well, gee, that sentence is too revealing, let's launder it, and so you wind up getting BS.
I can't not ask you, how do you compare the Trump of fear to the Nixon of the final days?
There are scenes in there right after Mueller is appointed where Trump is just beside himself, and you see him in the White House, and he doesn't sit down. He's just on his feet almost all the day, going from the Oval Office to the dining room where he has his television. He's watching, he's TiVoing things. How did this happen? Now there's a special counsel investigating me. They're going to look at my finances, and one of the people likens it to Nixon's final days, that it's in the paranoid zone. It's pretty scary. And Trump says, I'm the President of the United States. I can fire anybody I want. I have this authority. Well, actually, he does. Yeah. I think the real, one of the questions pulsing through this is, what does it mean? And I think one of the things it means is that this is and when Trump called last month, I said this to him, we are at a pivot point in history. And he said, right. And we really are at a pivot point in history. And that we better really think about where all this is going, who's in charge, who has authority, how is presidential power being exercised, is there an oversight of this process? And it's a time to, because there's this contest for what's true, and he's launched almost daily a war on truth, and that's not great for democracy.
In 1974, through Watergate, we had a crisis and the system worked. System triumphed. What's your level of confidence in the system this time? And I'm sorry, I'm going to get to the question right after this.
You have to have confidence in it, but the system only works when people rise above party. And in the case of setting up the Senate Watergate Committee in early 1973, Senator Ervin, who was the chairman, all that they had were the stories that Carl and I had written, and some investigation Teddy Kennedy's subcommittee had done. And I remember going to see Senator Ervin. He called me up and said, we'd like your sources. And I said, I can't do that. And he said, well, we're going to go ahead. And the resolution passed 77-0. Dozens of Republicans voting for that to investigate their president. I think in the Senate today, if you had a resolution to say, let's keep the colors in the American flag, you would not get a 77-0 vote. There would be some objection from someplace.
All right, let me ask you to make your questions brief and to the point and avoid any editorializing, and let's start on this side. Yes.
Hello, hi. Thank you, Mr. Woodward, I'm a huge admirer. I'm a student of journalism. I'm from Brazil, and this year we're going to have presidential elections, as you know, next month. And a true problem that I'm observing there is people are starting to become very true believers in well, their politics and their ideology or even their ideas. And I think from your experience, both of you, how can journalism improve in the sense of like showing the facts, like even if people are really true believers?
Well, get it right, and that takes time. And true believers, there are lots of them on lots of sides of politics. My just temperamental attitude is, be suspicious of true believers, but
your way of dealing with an environment in which people increasingly choose which truth to believe is to carry on and pursue the truth and not try to solve that problem because you can't?
That's a better answer.
Yeah. All right, this side.
I want to thank you and bless you and hope it's the tipping point. That's for your new partner. Today, one of the Spawn, I think it was Eric, said that it was Beavis or Butthead, one of those people, said that you did this for the shekels, which some of us feel is anti-Semitic. Since I don't think you're Jewish, except for hanging out with Carl Bernstein, could you please comment on that?
Factually, I am not Jewish, but the idea that anyone would talk like that, we shouldn't have comments like that from anyone, and it's unfortunate, but I think you can't kind of overreact to it. I think you kind of have to say, okay, what does it mean? What did Eric Trump do? Who is he? And there are still lots of questions about that in the investigation. So I'm not worried, and I think this kind of taking the emotion expressed by somebody else and having an emotional reaction to it gets you off track.
Mr. Woodward, it's a privilege. Thank you. Do you anticipate any of the people you've discussed coming forward before the 2020 election? It seems that if they're that concerned about the fate of the country, they would want to speak out before he gets another 4 years. Well,
people have spoken out in this book, and it's important to not get tangled up in, gee, is somebody going to write an editorial without specifics in the New York Times? I think that's not the real issue. I think is what's authoritative, what's going on. I mean, you said at one point something happened in the book and your jaw's on the floor. I think there are about 10 or 15 in the book.
Agree.
Since many people think that Trump is a threat to our national security, do you believe that GOP politicians, influential ones like Ryan and McConnell, are traitors to our country?
No. Look, we have the political system, and see, that's the word.
But he has access to the nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
That should be taken away from him.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well,
let Bob answer.
That's your view. I think the remedy is to not use Trump's language about other people. I think that you can be critical of people, and let's jack up the rhetoric atmosphere, I think is.
Well, hasn't he?
Okay,
sorry,
we know
we're trying to get quite a few.
We know what you think.
To the Russians.
Let's come back over here. Thank you. Sorry.
Obviously, Trump is still president. The Mueller investigation is still going on. I was wondering, when did you know that you were done with this book? When you can settle on, I'm done. And also, too, any roadblocks you had in this writing when you had a lead and you thought you were there, but you couldn't get the sources to completely fulfill the story?
Yeah. Do you work in publishing? Because
I'm a student.
It's a great question, and the answer is, on something like this, you're in a way never done, but you have to cut it off and say you've got enough information. I have the wonderful benefit of a support system at the Washington Post where I still work. at Simon & Schuster, the publishers, and they are, all these people say, they say individually and collectively, we have your back and dig into these things. And there also is just a quality when you've got about 350 pages, that's a book. And sorry, it's that simple.
Yeah. And will there be another Trump book? I mean, do you start the next one as soon as you finish?
Wow.
Yeah. You have created precedent for this.
Don't know. You don't know. Who knows the end of this story? Or, boy, I sure don't.
Yeah.
And so, but we need to keep working, even when the book is done.
Yeah, thank you for speaking. Based on your book and all the research and experience that you have, what do you think is possible that could happen as a result of the investigation? And do you think it's possible that nothing can happen? In other words, like nothing will happen?
In the Mueller investigation.
Yeah, as a result of that.
Sometimes nothing happens. In the book, John Dowd, who is Trump's lawyer for 8 months, who eventually resigns because he's trying to convince Trump, you can't testify because you won't tell the truth. You are incapable of. Isn't that? That's a stunning.
He seemed like he went there with Trump.
Yeah. They had a practice session in the White House, which is one of the most fascinating things I've ever written. And you hear John Dowd, the lawyer's playing Mueller and asking Trump questions, and Trump lies or makes things up or goes ballistic, and finally says, see, you can't testify. And Trump said, you mean I'm not a good witness? He said, no, you are a terrible witness. There's a legal obligation for a lawyer to not, as he said, I can't sit next to you and let you lie or fall into a perjury trap. And it's quite moving. And the final line of the book is Dowd concluding, but not wanting to insult Trump, but concluding, you're a fucking liar.
Yeah.
And it's one of those moments where you go, wow, that's that's the lawyer.
That's the guy on his side. Yeah. That's the guy he's paying.
Yeah. $100,000 a month, which is pretty good for Trump, and at least he paid it for a month, I understand.
The rare bill he paid, yes. Yeah, so.
Did any of your sources, in all their months alone with Trump in the White House, describe any private moments with him when he might have, just for a moment, confessed to his deepest fears? The obvious fear is that the Mueller investigation will lead to his impeachment, but fears of being betrayed as a Russian mole or a Russian tool, fears of being indicted over his tax.
If that had happened, I think I might have included it in the book.
So nobody ever described any private moment in which Trump confessed to his own fears about where this might end up, even losing the respect of his kids or something.
Well, no, but there are moments where he displays intense anxiety about the investigation. It's going to go on forever. They're going to look at everything. They're going to look at my finances and so forth. And he also acknowledges to people in the book at times, and those people are named, that maybe Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, should not be there working in the White House, that there's too much of a conflict potentially. And so, but the moment of, the Mueller investigation is, and it's the lawyer John Dowd who concludes that Mueller played him Dowd and Trump for suckers, to get them to turn over all the evidence and the documents and the witnesses. And there's a telling moment where Dowd realizes, my God, we've been had, and he goes to Trump and he said, you were right, we can't trust Mueller.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Mueller, by all accounts, his office is not leaking. So that account has to come primarily from one side, and it's self-serving in the sense that Dowd's position is, we've been an open book, we've given you everything. But do we know that from Mueller's side? Do we know that Mueller feels they've been that cooperative?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of reporting on it, and I checked this independently,
Right.
and
So you
they
believe
did
that.
give him they did give him all this material, and so you know that's authentic. What's interesting about Mueller in the book is he only says a number of things to Dowd, because most of the time he's just marble, he's just poker faced, and but he does. When Dowd's pressing him, what are you looking for on the obstruction investigation? And Mueller says, we want to find out if he had corrupt intent. Now that's the necessary part of an obstruction charge, and it's actually the right thing. And I think when Dowd heard this, it was a bracing moment.
Made it real that they were considering the possibility of bringing a charge like that.
Or that was the investigative trail they were on. But somebody, is it possible this goes nowhere? I remember too well the big investigations after Watergate, the Iran-Contra and the Reagan administration, the Lewinsky-Whitewater investigation under Clinton. And there were, somebody in my newspaper actually wrote a story saying Reagan was going to be indicted. And I went back and looked at all of the investigations after Watergate and talked to Lawrence Welch, who was the independent counsel in that case, and he made it very clear to me he didn't even think Reagan was dirty and had done anything illegal. So these things can get all puffed up, and you think it's somebody's going to discover the crime of the century, and they don't. You need a storytelling witness or tapes.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi, excuse me. If I recall correctly, when Nixon was unraveling, didn't Al Haig give instructions to most everyone that no matter what Nixon said, nuclear weapons and all, it couldn't go through? I'm sure that today, but you have people like General Mattis and the Pentagon, as you said, it's country first, Kelly, that they wouldn't allow Trump to give an order of any type they're real patriots, that would threaten the United States or the world.
That's a good question. I don't have the definitive answer on that, but in Watergate, it wasn't Al Haig, the White House Chief of Staff, it was the Secretary of Defense, Schlesinger, who put out the word saying, if the president calls and said launch, call me first.
Do you believe that, having talked with these people like Mathis and Kelly and so on, that Trump could ever get to that point, that if he wanted to distract something, or that he could, they would stop him at some point?
I don't know the answer to that, and that's a big, large question. It would depend on circumstances and what's going on. The reality is, though, the president has there's a concentration of power in that office, and he can employ the force as he wants to. I remember talking to academics during the George W. Bush years and say, the president can start a war like it has happened. He said, oh no, the Constitution is very clear that Congress has to declare war. And I tried to say that's not the way it works. And I said, look, George W. Bush can invade Mexico tomorrow if he wants. And somebody stood up in agony and said, don't give him any ideas. They have Presidents have incredible power.
Yes, first of all, I want to thank you very much. I just hope that this book will help end Trump's term in office quicker than it should. And on that point, and other people have spoken about this, if you had to give odds on Trump lasting 2 more years, what would you say the odds are of him being taken out of office?
I have that written down too. But
If you were betting then,
this is one of the diseases of journalism. I'd be interested if you agree, where we want to report on the future, which of course we don't know. And the future's real hard. It's a fair question, but to be honest with you, I have no fucking idea.
Deep in your heart. Deep in your heart, I think you do, but
I agree that's the best answer. You know, I think I hope I learned the lesson in 2016 that what I thought was going to happen with a high degree of likelihood did not happen, and I think that showed the value of my predictions and the value of a lot of other people's predictions. And so now when people ask me for a prediction, I disappointingly try to offer some kind of analysis, but avoid the prediction.
You know, a good line is that one I used, easier to describe the creation of the universe.
Yeah.
Because it is.
Yeah.
You have one.
I think let's take 2 more questions, and then we should let Bob sign some books. But go ahead, please.
Thank you. My question may sound a bit redundant after the last one, but I was going to ask you, when you lived through the whole Watergate crisis with Cole Bernstein, and you must have felt at some moment, had your aha moment where you thought, wow, this is where the president is going down. How has your gut instinct served you now? I know it leads on to it's in tandem with the other question, you know, what kind of timeline. But
can I give the same answer to this side of the room that I gave over there?
A little more, because my fear also is that obviously time works against us, and the longer this goes on, the longer a lot of these abnormalities tend to become the norm. And we find ourselves deeper and deeper. So basically, what's your gut been telling you in the difference between Watergate?
But you see, I try not to operate on my gut. In Watergate, Carl realized at a moment, he said, my God, Nixon's going to be impeached. And we'd written a story about his closest aide, John Mitchell, campaign manager, attorney general, controlling a secret fund for Watergate and other espionage and sabotage activities. And Carl turned around and said, this guy's going to be impeached. And I said, I agree, but we can never use that word in the newsroom because people will think we're on some sort of crusade. Right. And for 1 year, we never used that word. And so I would apply the same caution now about whether we think this is going to lead to that or that. The answer is we don't know, but the job of journalism is to, I don't know that Trump actually does read, whether he would read a copy of this book. I heard for a while I couldn't get a copy at the White House. The Simon & Schuster security was so great. But I think I'm sure he would be very upset because it's a penetration of his business. It says, this is what he does, this is what he thinks, this is the nature of the conflict, and so forth. And I've step back as a journalist and say that's all we can try to do, and then the political system will take over and do what it's going to do. And even though there's a lot of anger at the political system and a sense of disappointment, if not betrayal, it kind of works, and that's what we have. And so I'm not writing odds about anything or examining my gut. Hey, I love it when they open the door and say, "Are you still doing this shit?" Because the answer is yes.
Let's make this the last question, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but please go ahead.
Good evening. On the Daily yesterday, you alluded to some of the events that came out of your reporting on Watergate. So, avoiding the prior questions, what do you think are some takeaways from this book that we can bring out to our representatives and congressmen and women to alleviate the fear?
Well, I mean, that's obviously up to you, but this is, as I say in the prologue, that there's a nervous breakdown of executive power, and having a government with a nervous breakdown. I mean, do you agree this describes a nervous breakdown on a good number of levels?
And it's something very different from the kind of chaos, confusion, disorganization that has come up in many other White Houses. Yes, I agree. It's a breakdown of every kind of code of normal behavior in a presidential administration.
And so, you know, that's what it is, and it's. You know, I mean, can I tell one story?
Please.
I mean, this goes back to Watergate, but it was a great lesson. In January '73, Carl and I'd written all these stories. People didn't believe them. And Katharine Graham, the publisher, owner of the Washington Post, invited me to lunch. And I knew her. She'd supported the publication of the stories, and go into her lunchroom. And she starts quizzing me about Watergate, and blew my mind with what the boss knew. She at one point said, she'd read something about Watergate in the Chicago Tribune, and I thought, what the hell is she reading the Chicago Tribune for? No one in Chicago does, but Catherine was, you know, sucking in all the information of management style I later described as mind on, hands off. She didn't tell us how to report or what to do. And so we get to an important moment, and she said, well, when is all the truth going to come out? And I said, well, there's a cover-up going on. The investigation's weak. They're paying the burglars for their silence. Carl and I go knock on doors at night, and Nixon had just won a massive re-election. So my answer is never. And I'll never forget the look on her face when I said never. And she said, pained, wounded look. She said, never? Don't tell me never. I left the lunch a highly motivated employee. But the statement was not a threat. It was a statement of purpose. And what she said was, look, we signed up for this. Journalism is high risk. We believe our sources. And then she said, why do you think we do this? And I didn't have an answer. And she gave an answer to her own questions, and it's a brilliant answer. She said, because that's the business we're in. We believe what we've got here. We have to triple, quadruple our effort to get to the bottom of this, and gave a kind of, let's go ahead. I left the lunch highly motivated. I was 29 years old at the time. And I thought, my God, the boss really understands the necessity of risk. It doesn't mean you aren't sure. It means that you're taking on the highest authority in the country by yourself, essentially. So someday we're going to put a plaque in the lobby of the Washington Post, even though Bezos owns the Washington Post now. and the Grahams are not there, I think he would approve of this, but we're going to drill it in so no one can take it out. And it's going to be a plaque that will just begin, quote, and it will say, never, don't tell me, never, end quote. Catherine Graham.
Well, that is a great note to end on, and one I can heartily support. Bob, it's an honor to talk to you about the new book, and I want to thank everybody for the great questions and for being here. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Books in the next room.
Yeah, books in the next room.